Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Ian Cross. I'm the digital executive producer at News 5 Cleveland, and I am speaking today with Kevin Benz with the Neeland Project. He came to our station a bit over a year ago to conduct EDI training. So Kevin, thank you again for joining us. And why don't you start by telling us a little about your company, what you do, and what EDI training is?
Well, I'm a broadcast journalist. I've been working in television journalism for virtually my whole career. Started out as a video photographer, and now I like to call myself a recovering news director. I was a news director for 14 years here in Austin before starting my company and Kevin Benz News, and really working with stations like yours in order to coach newsrooms, help journalists do their jobs more efficiently, better, and keep working on better journalism as we go forward. The EDI process really started. You were one of the early stations that we did there in Cleveland, as a matter of fact, back a little over a year ago. And I really need to give Scripps credit for this. Scripps has made a unique commitment to try to touch every station in their group. I think that's 60 plus newsrooms that they're working in. Yep. And it does my heart good to know that something that we've been working on for so long touches the newsrooms and has helped people like you think about how inclusion is reflected inside of the news that you're producing.
Great, yeah. And just for those who don't know, can you explain what EDI stands for, and then kind of a little bit more in depth about what that kind of training entails?
Yeah, people call it different things depending on where you are, but EDI is equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this can be in talking about the workplace. It can be talking about each individual and how we recognize the biases, the unconscious biases that we carry around with us. And it can also, as in this case, it can be reflected in the news that is being produced by journalists around the country. And so what we're trying to do is help journalists recognize their own biases, particularly because as journalists, we need to recognize those biases in order to mitigate them. A big part of the journalism that we produce involves us understanding that we come to the world with a very specific perspective on it. The perspective that is only shared by us, no one else. And so as journalists, we want to be able to identify those things so that we can mitigate them and fairly portray people in the news that we produce and in the content we produce.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I think one of the early things that we talked about during our training session was kind of representation in the newsroom and how that affects our coverage. Can you speak a little bit too about how making sure that everyone is represented in the newsroom and how that helps?
Well, newsroom diversity has been a topic of conversation for many years, thank goodness, because for a long time it wasn't something that was really recognized as being important, and it is important. It is important not just because a newsroom, the look, the optics of the newsroom should be a reflection of the community itself. But it's also important because each individual brings very specific ideas and perspectives to the table. And those perspectives can be shared with the entire group in order to make our news and content producing more indicative of the many ideas, the many perspectives that exist in the community. If we all share an idea inside of the newsroom, we're probably not getting to the heart of that idea. We need more perspective. We need more ideas coming from different people. A diversity inside of the newsroom reflects that. Now, and let's be really clear here, Ian. We're not just talking about a diversity by race, right? Although that's incredibly important and it's the thing we see the most. But we also need to be talking about diversity by gender, diversity by sexual orientation, diversity by age, diversity by geography, diversity by disability, and diversity particularly in affiliation, whether that's political affiliations, religious beliefs. All of that diversity should be included in the way a newsroom reflects the people that it's covering.
Absolutely, yeah. Those are all excellent points, and I think something that we've definitely taken to heart here at the station, since the training is, now that when we break out into different subgroups to, tackle different projects, I think one thing that we weren't doing before your training was making sure that, those, those different voices were getting represented in those groups, whether it's a small little group project or an entire newsroom wide, initiative. So absolutely. Now, I think another big part of your training was, not just consideration of our own makeup, but also, the consideration of the makeup of the community that we're covering, and making sure that, those voices are included in our coverage as well. Can you talk a little bit about how your training kind of addresses that?
Yeah, well, one of the big points that we talk about a lot in just in newsrooms in general is what's the community that we serve? What are they thinking? What's going on in their minds? What's causing the responses and reactions to events that are happening? What do they think about that? What's happening in the community? Now, look, if all of us look alike in the newsroom and we have one sort of single way of thinking, we're going to miss ideas about going into different places that don't traditionally get talked to or interviewed. After all, as a news organization, one of the things that we believe in, and the reason I think a lot of journalists go into this business is because we want to make the communities we serve better places to live, right? I mean, we want to help people. It's why we do journalism. And we can't do that well if we don't know and understand all the various communities that we are serving. Too often we will go into communities because bad things happen. That's what leads us in there. Somebody gets shot, somebody gets robbed, a business gets robbed, a drug deal is broken up, and arrests are made. And we do a good job covering crime in those communities. The trouble is that we don't do a great job covering life in those communities. What is it like to live there? Many people choose to live in communities that we only go to for bad things. And here's what happens. If we don't learn what's happening, what life is like in those communities, we'll never be able to understand not just the good things, but also the pressure points. Those areas where people are working hard to overcome. It could be a lack of grocery stores. It's difficult to get good food for your family. It could be because there are too many liquor stores. It could be pressure points about infrastructure. We don't have good sidewalks or education. But we have to get into those communities and learn what those pressure points are, not just visit them when bad things are happening, because then we don't understand the response and reaction that people in those communities have.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Kevin. And one, not to keep talking about our station, but one of the initiatives that we formed to really kind of address that was our Better Land franchise, which really highlights champions of the city of Cleveland and the surrounding area, and really delves deep into kind of the systemic issues within the city and the champions that are kind of working to overcome those issues. And I think that your training certainly helped us to identify those stories and really get those out. So.
Yeah, and Ian, one of the next steps after thinking about that, which is great. I mean, holding up people doing great things inside of your community is really, really important. And we also want that to apply right to everyday life. So a big part of inclusion, equity and inclusion, is understanding that from a news perspective, we want a great diversity of thought and ideas and people inside of that content. And we need to remember that we need to cover people not because they are underserved or disenfranchised, not because they're Black or Asian or disabled. We need to cover people because they're people. Because they're doing things in their community, because they're regular folks, and looking for great expert sources, not experts because they're Black, experts because they're experts. And systemically in our newsrooms, there have been situations, setups that have happened that keep us from finding those folks. And it is one major piece of the discussion that we need to be really working hard to find people living their lives just as people. There was a great piece of research that was done a couple of years ago. It was right before that we did our work in Cleveland with you guys. And that research talked about how negative portrayals of people of color are really bad, right? I mean, we have a tendency in television news in particular. The research shows us, University of Illinois research shows us that when people of color are presented on the news, most of the time those people are being portrayed as either being poor, on welfare, or involved in crime. Most of the time, that's the way they're seen, which is terrible, right? We know that that's not everyday life for people of color or those communities. And as bad as that is, what's even worse, according to this research, is the lack of positive portrayals of underserved communities, people of color in particular. Because there's no aspiration, there's no inspiration. If we don't see people, if you're a young Black man watching the news, and you don't see people who look like you doing great things as accountants or as lawyers or doctors or vice presidents, if you don't see that, there's nothing to inspire you, there's nothing to aspire to. And so one of our jobs is to make sure that our diversity is shown not just in holding people up who are doing great things, but also in the everyday stories of life in the community we serve.
Absolutely. That's such a great perspective. And, you know, I can tell you that is actually something that we really have taken to heart as a newsroom is, you know, on stories. And as you said, not just stories about crime or welfare, but, you know, when we're covering COVID-19, when we are looking for medical experts to talk to, you know, we are now asking, you know, is there a doctor of color? Is there someone, you know, of color that we can speak to? And, you know, frankly, at first, you know, it felt a little odd, you know, making that ask, but, you know, now, you know, after the first few times, you know, now these organizations are, you know, I think it's kind of spread to them, you know, they're not even, you know, we don't have to ask them anymore. You know, they are, you know, seeking out those individuals, you know, and they're exactly just as qualified and, you know, just as, you know, able to talk to us as anybody else. And it is such a great, you know, experience being able to see, you know, someone that maybe not the first person that they would have necessarily gone to, but, you know, but is, you know, because of those internal biases that they don't even know about, you know, we are actually helping them just by making that ask. And, you know,
you know, we do tend to go to the same people all the time because, you know, they say, yes, I'll let you interview me. And yes, come on over, or I've got a great computer and great internet. And so come on in. So we tend to go back to those people because it's a time saver for us. Right. And it's so great. It's station after station like you. And I know you guys were one of the stations that really embraced this idea of going out and finding great people that we can interview and making sure that we were interviewing folks that are diverse in ideas and in perspective, as well as diverse in the lives that they live. And I remember in Cleveland, because it was early on, I can remember this, after we had gotten done, and this was a long bit of coaching, right? You guys spent some 12, 14 hours, something like that.
Yeah,
each individual
was a marathon.
in training in 3 different parts. And I remember I was last. I bring up the tail on this one. And we're talking about journalism. I remember when I had gotten finished, there were a number of people from your station who walked up to me. And it wasn't about saying thank you. It was much more about saying, you gave me so much to think about. And what's so great about that is that none of this works if the individual isn't self-reflective about how they see the world, because how we see the world is individual to each one of us. And so being self-reflective, understanding, you know what, I do carry biases around with me, and that's okay. Those are the things that make me who I am. And I'm not doing a great job mitigating those biases in order to make sure that I'm fairly portraying everyone, because I'm not sure I know. I'm not sure I've taken the time to learn what others are thinking, using my empathy skills in order to find out what it's like to be someone else and asking those questions. That's the greatest thing to hear when they say, you've given me a lot to think about.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
That is the first step in moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I can speak for, you know, everyone that I spoke to after that session. I think we all had, you know, very similar, you know, responses to it. And yeah, it definitely carried on. And what was so great about it was that it went so much deeper than just your typical workplace sensitivity training or those same training courses that they make you take and watch a video from 15 years ago. It really did kind of challenge, I think, all of us to some degree, our perceptions, and I think led to a lot of growth as a newsroom. Absolutely.
The best journalism challenges, right? The best journalism makes us uncomfortable because we're learning something from it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Last thing I'll ask, and maybe you can kind of speak a bit about what you've seen, maybe from our station if you've been following us, or maybe from other stations that you've been to. And not to put you on the spot there, I totally understand. But after these trainings take place, can you speak a little bit about what these efforts look like in practice? Have there been any newsrooms that have really gone on to grow, and do you have any kind of examples? And you don't have to get too specific, you don't have to call anybody out, but I'd love to know if you have any really great success stories.
Well, first of all, the great success story is across all of the stations. The fact that every station is being touched by this and is thinking about it, right? Thinking about how we fairly portray all of our community, the entire community that we serve, because for too long we weren't fairly portraying everyone. And that thought process is important. There are some commonalities, though, that we've certainly seen as we've gone through. And the first is, we've touched on a couple of those. The first is really developing a diverse database of experts, so that not everyone we talk to from an expert standpoint, not every doctor about COVID, not every accountant at tax time, not every lawyer regarding issues of law and courts, not every one of them is an older white man, that we're cognizant of that. And so we're developing these databases of people to go to, that we're cognizant about how we're using mugshots. Many of the stations, most of the stations in your group are looking at how they use mugshots. Some have said, we're not going to use mugshots at all unless the story demands it, unless it is relevant to telling the story and informing the community. How is it relevant? Well, if they're looking for the guy and you've got a mugshot, yeah, you're going to use that. If they're looking, have you seen this person? Because we're looking for more crimes they've committed. Yes, that's relevant. If it's the mayor who did it, yeah, that's probably relevant, right? But in most cases, when we're portraying people in mugshots, there's no relevance to that. And in fact, what we end up doing is perpetuating negative stereotypes. And so many of the stations in the group have come up with clear guidelines about how they're going to use mugshots, how they're going to cover crime, how they cover crime. Are we covering crimes that are meaningful, or are we simply covering crimes because it's easy? And most of the stations that I have worked with and in your group are really reflecting on how much crime is covered and how they are covering that crime. Instead of covering crime, many stations now are covering criminal justice, which is a much larger and more important issue that really is meaningful to the community. How are people treated in the courts? How are decisions made about arrests? Who gets arrested and who doesn't? That's criminal justice coverage. And that has made a real difference in a lot of communities in your group. So these are the things that we're seeing across the group, and doing things like you're doing, making sure that we're telling positive stories about everyone in our community, whether that's a better land or the rebound or any number of other terrific ideas for franchises or everyday stories. So that kind of, look, if I was going to say there's one thing that we see on the air from all of these television stations, is that we see effort being made to show the whole community in its wonderful diversity. Everyone we serve is reflected accurately. That effort is worthwhile, and it's worth celebrating.
Absolutely, Kevin. Well, that's I think a great hopeful note to end on, and I think it's such a great kind of thesis statement for what you do, and what our station was proud to take part in. Any last thoughts, or?
I would only say it has been a great honor to work with all of these stations, and I want to go back to where we started. Scripps deserves a ton of credit, and the Scripps leadership. This is not easy to do. This takes great courage to do. And they committed to it. They have stuck to it through the pandemic, going from in-person visits to virtual training and coaching. Scripps is really guiding the way through what needs to be powerful equity, diversity, and inclusion inside of our newsrooms. And by the way, Scripps started doing it before it was cool, well before the Black Lives Matter protests happened, well before the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor issues occurred. Yeah. Scripps was working on this before that. Scripps was doing this before that, and I think they should get great credit for it.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I'll make sure that that gets passed up. And, thankfully we did. I think that was such a huge part of how we covered, the protests and, that entire summer. Every day it seemed like we were going back to the lessons that we learned from you and the rest of the trainers. So, I think it was such a boon for us to have that training, and not just already have it ingrained in our newsroom by that time. So, absolutely,
it's great to hear.
Yeah, definitely. Great, Kevin. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. And we actually did a podcast as well about this very topic, which you might be interested in watching listening to yourself. So I'll definitely send you that link and send you a link to this story. Once it goes up as well. So again, thank you so much for taking the time, and definitely look forward to speaking to you again soon. I imagine it's not a one-time thing, right? It is a constant question that you have to be asking the newsroom, and I imagine sometime in the future we'll probably need a little refresher. So looking forward to it.
At your service, Ian. At your service.
All right. Well, have a great night, and stay safe out there.
Be well, sir.
Be well. Have a good day.